Hello, my name is Becky Perez, and I'm a practicing school psychologist in the state of Illinois. I will be presenting to you on my dissertation research project I completed in 2011, focusing on the ethical practices of school psychologists in school settings and the impact policy has on the evaluations of English language learners. My context was the state of Indiana, and the foundation of my dissertation project actually evolved from research I conducted as a member of the Equity Project at Indiana University. The project was federally funded and studied addressing and understanding the implications of disproportionality in special education. As such, I will present this in two parts. The first video will focus on the historical background leading up to the dissertation project, focusing on patterns of disproportionality and also the reasons for which disproportionality develops for specific ethnic and racial minority groups. I will then follow up with a second video that will focus on the dissertation study and looks at the practices of school psychologists and the dilemmas that we face in our day in, day out evaluations of English learners. To begin, I want to reiterate that today I hope to be able to provide you some motivation, some perspective into the practices of school psychologists in the school setting, specific to legal, ethical, and professional practice. Domain 10, which is an area in which we are trained to be prepared to use to inform our practices. And the information we gather over the course of our training should inform our knowledge and about the history of school psychology and the different types of service models and information and methods that we study and provide in school settings and beyond. The other aspect of it is the ethical, legal, and professional standards that guide our practices and inform us as we develop our professional identity. This is really at the foundation of the research and information I'll provide today. For various reasons, I think that this is something that we need to continuously be trained and prepared to deal with in multiple professional settings. So this is really something that I'll hone in on and come full circle towards the end of this presentation in the second part. So what I'd like to ask and have you contemplate for a moment is what shapes our decision-making on issues of inequity? For example, an issue of inequity that we face in special education is disproportionality. Many folks would agree that disproportionality in special education can be an issue of inequity in terms of access to services, misidentification, etc. Let me present to you the most kind of straightforward way of identifying patterns of disproportionality. One way of doing this is called the composition index, which compares the percent of enrollment of racial, ethnic groups or other subgroups to their percent of the population receiving special education services. So group 1 and group 3 actually have very similar patterns of disproportionality, because what we see here is these uneven bars that represent some form of difference. And what we find in these patterns is that they're actually underrepresented, group 1 and group 3 in special education, compared to their percent enrollment in the general population. Now for group 2, we actually have the contrasting picture of disproportionality, which is overrepresentation, where the percent of the population is actually much lower than the percent of kids actually being identified for special education services. The other group, group 4, as you can see, the bar graph shows these two bars side by side are proportionate. What we would expect is the percent of enrollment of a particular racial or ethnic group is going to be comparable to the percent of those children receiving special education services. In some ways, in an ideal world, that would be equitable. So for the purpose of this presentation and the one to follow, we're focusing on the disproportionality patterns of Latinos in the context of Indiana. What we know right now nationally is that Latinos are over and underrepresented in special education. Now, when we have over-identification or over-representation of a particular racial or ethnic group in special education, it leads us to maybe the theory that we might be misidentifying or over-identifying students into special education. When we have patterns of underrepresentation, that can be a little more challenging to explain. What does that really mean? Does it mean we need to identify more students for special education? Is it really a problem that needs addressing? So our goal in this presentation and the research studies that contributed to this work really focused in on trying to better understand these patterns and what they meant. Well, why were we so focused on this? I can honestly say, as a practicing school psychologist, our jobs can be quite isolating. Our evaluation practices are highly individualized, and we use a lot of our own knowledge, training, and experience to make decisions. And so we ask ourselves a variety of questions in the process of evaluating English learners or ethnic and racial minorities. We ask ourselves questions because we want to be culturally competent in our evaluation practices. And so the pressure to make the right decisions is, immense. So, what if a student group is underreferred and we're aware of this? What questions should we be asking as practitioners? In order to make sense of underrepresentation, as I mentioned, the Equity Project really honed in on evaluating school districts experiencing disproportionality. But before being able to evaluate a school district's practices, we really needed to make sense as to what we were seeing for particular groups. My interest was to explore the patterns for Latino English learners. Again, I'll use that interchangeably because of the dynamics and the population in the state of Indiana. So I'll begin by talking about study one, which just looks at the range of disproportionality rates, really provided us some background information, what it looked like for Indiana and what it looked like nationally. Our second study really focused in on going the qualitative route to explore the process of referring students for special education and all of the decisions that were involved in that process within a local context. The last study will be presented in a separate video to follow, focusing specifically on the practices of school psychologists. So what we want to do is provide you a broad picture. At the time of our research study, our first policy briefing, we were looking at Latino disproportionality, and we not only wanted to look at it from the perspective of Indiana, but we wanted it a broader scope. And so we looked at the federally funded project, NCREST, and looked at their data to really better understand the patterns for overall disability. So although this information is dated, I think it's still very interesting and foundational in the work that came after. What it was telling us is that the patterns of disproportionality for Latino students was actually highly underrepresented across the southeastern and midwestern portions of the nation. Now, how did we come up with this? So those blue states and then the one red state, Nebraska, were actually identified using Indiana-based criteria. Indiana came up with its own criteria for identifying disproportionality for over and underrepresentation. States in blue are underrepresented, states in red were over. If you went to another state, used their criteria, perhaps this map would look differently. But I think we used a very conservative perspective because in reality, we're looking at the relative risk of a child in a particular subgroup being placed in special education compared to all other students. So for us, it was really telling as to where Indiana stood and where it was in the greater picture in terms of regions. Status of underrepresentation. So if we were to summarize this information, we found predominantly Latinos are underrepresented. They were underrepresented in high and low incidence categories. Interestingly, we had commonly underrepresentation in learning disability. And we also found that 20% of Indiana schools were experiencing underrepresentation of Latino students. Now, this didn't drive us to go and identify those districts as out of compliance or needing remediation or supports, but we wanted to better understand these patterns. And so it led us to our exploratory qualitative study that focused on the perceptions of educators working with Latino students and families, their efficacy for working with this population, their perception of the availability of resources, and also exploring their own decision-making process and what they knew about policies and practices for referring children that are also learning English and Latino for special education services. So the findings of this research really kind of fell into contribution of student and family factors and the contributions of school factors. The contribution of student and family factors are going to be described in the next kind of highlighted quotes from our participants. They fell into these themes: characteristics for success, language issues, appropriateness of referrals, and parent involvement. So to highlight, one of the ways that Latino children that were learning English were described in these contexts really fell around this concept of the golden child. Well, what do we mean by that? The way that we were hearing educators talk about Latino, and they referred to them sometimes as Hispanic students or ELL students, was the following. I wish I had more Hispanic students because they're more respectful. Teachers automatically assume it is a language barrier rather than a disability, and I think that this happens for a lot of well-behaved kids. I think where the barrier comes in is where, as a parent, I can sit down and help my child, but they can't really go home and get that extra help always because the parents are having the same barrier. So all in all, we have well-behaved kids, maybe not really sticking out in terms of the kids that might need additional support. And also that we're hearing folks say, maybe the expectation that kids can go home and get extra help is high. So we have to adjust that based on what we know about parents from the Latino community. The other aspects that they shared with us was that in their minds, testing didn't seem to be the exact answer when a kid was struggling from this particular subgroup. Here's an ELL expert's perspective. Now, mind you, they often know a lot about English learning and the cultural shock and all of the different aspects of the experience that Latino ELL students may have in a school setting. So this particular coordinator states, there is resistance. I think everybody is trying to figure out what's language and what's not. That's been part of the drive for some additional sorts of assessment before children go to our GEI process. For them, that was their problem-solving process. We also heard from mainstream teachers that reported kind of their confusion about what was appropriate in terms of referring ELL students for any type of evaluation or intervention. Here we have a mainstream teacher stating, it seems to me they are screened in both Spanish and English. I have not observed that many, so I do not know if that actually happens or not. Another stakeholder identified kind of the gray areas in what we call what was legal, what was policy, and the right timing for a referral. This general education teacher stated, legally, or I guess policy-wise, they have to be here 2 years. Also, our general retention policy is no English ESL student will be retained in kindergarten, but otherwise, I am unsure. Another theme that emerged from the qualitative study was this idea of fear of misidentification. And as you have read previously, this is a historical fear, not only for multiple stakeholders, but specifically for school psychologists. So here we have a school psychologist stating, I'd rather err on the side of caution and give them the chance to be exposed and everything. It's not that I don't want the truly learning disabled, it's just let's be careful. So in summary, we found that there were a lot of contributing factors associated with perhaps the development of underrepresentation patterns. The perception of Latino ELO students and their families was parents have difficulty advocating for themselves. The kids look like they're on the right track, and hey, let's give them time to develop language, which in a lot of ways is good practices. We don't want to knock that. But we also heard from folks that had low confidence in assessing Latino students, so to some extent avoiding those referrals. There was limited access to language support, so we oftentimes were waiting for language to develop, but the quality of services was also limited. And lastly, we had unclear guidelines and practices in referral assessment and eligibility. The following presentation is going to focus on my dissertation study, which looked at the low confidence we as school psychologists had in assessing Latino students that were also English learners, and also looking at the guidelines that were helping us make decisions about the referral, assessment, and eligibility process. So I will present to you in the second part of this presentation, Ethics, Policy, and Street Level Bureaucracy and Evaluations for Special Education.